Well, a window on how well all this is working is what the trends and developments in performance or incentive pay, which include bonuses and equity-based arrangements over various timeframes. These were originally imported to Australia with a crop of United States CEOs in the 1990s, and indeed they have accounted for much of the growth in remuneration since then. They've been favoured by shareholders and boards as a means of aligning motivations of executives with the interests of shareholders themselves, and in particular by requiring executives to have some skin in the game through remuneration linked to equity. But that shift has also increased uncertainty for executives, create a need for what's called a risk premium or a higher headline remuneration. And they've also created some risks for the companies themselves if those incentive packages are not well designed. As they say, incentives will drive behaviour. You've got to make sure that they're the right incentives. So how well has all this worked? The evidence found by the Commission found that the evidence was mixed. On the positive side, the composition of remuneration in terms of performance pay and base pay, those ratios seem broadly okay and to accord with what shareholders say they want. We've not seen some of the more problematic forms of pay in Australia to the extent that they've existed in the US, like reliance on options or non-recourse loans. And at an aggregate level, we've seen a correlation between pay increases or total remuneration increases and overall market returns. But there are some negatives. One is that the performance hurdles on performance pay could be described as relatively permissive in the 1990s, particularly for some firms. Since then, those arrangements have become incredibly complex. We've often heard people say they don't understand them, and some of those people are members of boards. The combination in both those circumstances is likely to have led to bigger payoffs than executives warranted and potentially more for luck than for good performance. And we've also seen some termination payments which are pretty hard to reconcile and would suggest weaknesses in the boards that endorse them. So we found a potential case for intervention, but what kind of intervention in this market would help on balance? The answer, at least our preliminary answer in our draft report that you've seen, is not to impose direct controls on executive remuneration, which we saw as having major risks and costs that could backfire on shareholders and the wider community. It's integral to the public company structure, which has been a major source of wealth creation, that the board has a central role in a whole range of strategic decisions, and including executive remuneration. Boards need to ensure that executive remuneration is appropriate, and they need to be accountable, more accountable than they currently are, for doing that job well. So the recommendations for government intervention in the Commission's draft report are about improving the system by improving the market, not bypassing it or undermining it. And we found plenty of scope for such improvement in 15 recommendations directed at enhancing board capability, addressing the perception of the club. Secondly, removing scope for conflicts of interests, how decisions are made and who participates in that decision making. And thirdly, increasing accountability to shareholders through better quality disclosure. There's plenty of disclosure, but nobody can understand it. And by increasing the say on pay that shareholders have. And of course, our two strikes proposal is one that's excited a little bit of controversy in that respect. But we've also argued that those interventions should be calibrated in forms that recognise the diversity of companies and the fact that one size in this area, one size of regulation does not fit all and shouldn't be made to be imposed on all. We're also conscious that the scope for unintended consequences in an area like that is pretty high, and we've been hearing about some alleged unintended consequences from our proposals in hearings that we've been conducting, and we'll consider these in preparing our final report. Well, the second current inquiry, where we're being called upon to advise governments about the right balance in regulation or intervention and in relation to market freedom, is gambling. Now, some of you will know this current inquiry is a reprise of one that we did 10 years ago, which has again been triggered by community concern that the private is out of kilter with the social. In this case, again, some of you may have seen that the Productivity Commission in its draft report recommended a stronger regulatory role in constraining decision-making within the market. We concluded that, unlike executive remuneration, there were significant systemic failures that had led to excessive social costs and needed to be addressed. Now, gambling is enjoyable for many, and the majority of people in this room would have had a flutter at some point, even if only on the Melbourne Cup. But it's a source of significant harms to some so-called problem gamblers and their families. And we've seen a major increase in the social costs of this kind, with the liberalisation in particular of poker machines over the years. Now, poker machines have a number of features which are particularly problematic. They involve intensive play, and I'll come back to that. They involve, in many cases, faulty cognitions. People don't properly understand how they operate or what's involved. The prices are obscure. They have conditioning effects, partly through the random payouts that they involve. They're very accessible, highly accessible as a gambling form, probably more accessible in Australia than anywhere in the world. And they're attractive to vulnerable people. Now, the industry would say, but this is only 1 to 2% of the population. But the facts are that 1% or 2% translate to 15 to 30% of those who play these machines regularly, and 40%, more or less, of industry revenue. That last statistic means that in this particular market, it's not possible to rely on self-regulation, and indeed government itself, which gets 10% at the state level of own source revenue on average from gambling, is also conflicted. Hence, while we've seen some progress in harm minimisation, as it's called, harm minimisation interventions over the past decade since the Commission's last report, much of those actions have been ineffectual, characterised, I guess, as clocks and warnings. The rewards from doing this better, from having a more effective intervention, are potentially very great, calculated by the Commission as adding up to billions of dollars in potential welfare. Doing that, however, is not easy. The goal is to target the source of the problem, which is the problem gamblers, without detracting from the enjoyment or the benefits from recreational gamblers, which are also worth large sums of money. The Commission drew on an eclectic policy framework which drew on public health, consumer protection and medical strands in looking at what was needed or what would work. You could call it a pragmatic framework, probably, Bernie. We focused in particular on two areas: the gambling environment, the environment within venues where gambling takes place, and secondly, informed consent. And in three key areas we saw a need for increased regulation. I'll just speak very briefly about these. One is so-called pre-commitment options. Secondly, by reducing the intensity of play and the capacity for people to lose money in a short period of time. And thirdly, in reducing the accessibility of the more harmful gambling forms. Now, the first of these, the pre-commitment, is akin to executive remuneration in the sense of trying to make the market work better. The focus here is on informed choice, on giving greater power to consumers. And essentially what it involves, what pre-commitment involves, is making use of technologies, and there's very rapid advances going on right now, to allow gamblers to set limits on their own future behaviour in relation to how much they would like to lose and how much time they'd like to spend. We've argued that this should be voluntary, but importantly, in drawing on the behavioural economics literature, that the system should be an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system, and some of you will know it can make a big difference. Well, Victoria has indicated that it will introduce a pre-commitment regime by 2016. The Commission has recommended that this be extended to all jurisdictions. But we've also put some pegs in the ground in terms of what kind of regime would be effective in dealing with these problems, and in particular it needs to be a regime that has universal coverage, one that covers not only all of the machines in a venue, but all of the venues within striking distance of any particular problem gambler. Meanwhile, until that happens, and there's a lot of work that would need to be done to achieve that, and a degree of coordination, particularly in terms of standards, will be very important, there's a strong case for constraining the scope for losses by problem gamblers without impairing the enjoyment of recreational gamblers. Currently it's possible, I don't know whether anyone's tried this, but it's currently possible to bet up to $12,000 per hour on a pokie machine. And you can lose on average $1,200 per hour, but you can lose a lot more than that. That's a hell of a lot for a recreational activity. The Commission's therefore recommended that there be a substantial reduction in how much one can bet with each button push, down from $10 or $5 a push to $1, and how much money can be fed into a machine at any one time. Believe it or not, you can feed $10,000 into a machine and having sitting there at any one time. We've suggested what looks like a revolutionary change to $20 to $40 at any one time. Such changes will impact on problem gamblers, however, and indeed it will irritate them, and that's the whole purpose. They themselves recognise that they want to be irritated at such moments when they're in their more lucid states of mind. Now, while this will help the 1 to 2% of the population in that category without hurting many of the other 98%, it will hurt the bottom line of clubs, hotels and casinos. And it will hurt the tax revenue of governments, another reason why the Henry Review is so important. But the important thing is that overall, the Commission's judgment is that the nation's welfare would be enhanced by that shift in the balance of regulation from freedom to intervention. Well, just quickly, some lessons that I take from those two current inquiries in terms of the bigger issues of getting the right balance in regulation between the market and intervention. But we came up with quite different answers in terms of the degree of intrusive intervention that was warranted. So the first lesson about intervention and markets is that it's horses for courses, again drawing on Bernie's comment about the need for a pragmatic approach. Unless you're operating in a perfect market with social and private valuations and effects coinciding and complete information for all, there will be a case potentially for some intervention to influence behaviour, and how much and what kind will depend on the particular market. Secondly, interventions that can target the source of a problem without having an effect on side effects or other collateral damage will generally be superior and give greater confidence of a net benefit for the community over a longer term. In the case of gambling, as I indicated, we calibrated the measures to be ones that had disproportionately their impacts on problem gamblers. And in the case of executive remuneration, a number of the recommendations that we've made essentially involve codifying what already is accepted as best practice by the best firms. Thirdly, sometimes while markets give rise to social costs, there's no intervention that can reduce those costs without involving greater costs. In other words, in some situations, while we'll see a problem, there's no way for government to solve it without causing greater problems. And in those situations, although it's politically difficult, no action is the most appropriate course for government to adopt. Fourthly, knowing whether and how to intervene so as to do good, at least not to do harm, is rarely straightforward, and getting this right demands good analysis and good evidence, which must include consultation with those likely to be affected, so it also requires good process. The Commission's never done an inquiry where our final report to government hasn't differed or benefited from the exposure of the draft report to feedback from the community. The law of unintended consequences holds most firmly when consultation is weakest. So fifthly and finally, and related to that, there are particular risks of unintended consequences when making ad hoc or piecemeal changes to an interactive system, which is the essence of a market. One example that came to light in our executive remuneration inquiry illustrates how risky that can be. Public concern in the United States about rising levels of remuneration in that country led to a cap being placed of $1 million on the tax deductibility of base salaries. This had two unforeseen consequences. One was a levelling up of base salaries more generally to that ceiling, to that $1 million ceiling, but the second and more problematic one was a rapid growth in less transparent forms of remuneration involving obscure incentive structures that have since been implicated in the origins of the global financial crisis, among other things. So in summing up, markets perform a very valuable role. They're integral to the process of economic development and the reduction of poverty worldwide. But they're rarely entirely free and indeed depend for their existence and proper functioning on a framework of regulation. Markets also cannot meet all policy goals and need to be complemented by government intervention that either fills the gaps or influences behaviour of market participants to align the private and public interests. Getting this right is very hard. Learning by doing is an important part of that, but like all experiments, it should be possible to change regulation, change intervention in the light of experience, and that can be particularly hard to do. The global financial crisis has revealed weaknesses in financial regulation, especially overseas, which calls for action. But the solutions need to be carefully calibrated to address the source of the problems and not give rise to collateral damage on innovation, productivity and the benefits that flow from that. In other words, there needs to be careful analysis on the merits and accounting for the system as a whole. That's very challenging, but getting it right will bring dividends for the whole community. Thank you very much.
Is there another country in the world where the two strikes policy is already operating, and what effects has that had?
I don't believe there is another country. Australia's been a leader in many areas of public policy. Some people are telling us we shouldn't be a leader in this area. But of course the same thing was said about the advisory vote on remuneration reports some time ago, that would cause all sorts of problems to have shareholders having a vote, having a say on the remuneration report, even if that didn't lead to anything. What we've been looking at and what we've proposed is giving a little bit more grunt to that no vote, but short of intruding into the role of the board in deciding what the structure of remuneration would be. So the two strikes policy was intended to increase the signal from shareholders in the first instance through a requirement for boards to report back, and if they hadn't reported back and there was a sufficient threshold of discontent, that they would be required to stand for re-election. Now, as you can imagine, we've had a lot of reaction to that proposal, and the point I made earlier stands that we put our draft reports out. They are genuinely draft reports, and we look at all those things in making a decision. So in that area, as in some others, we haven't had the benefit of overseas experience, although there have been recommendations in other jurisdictions that are similar, or at least in the same ballpark to that. But we don't see that as a reason for not making recommendations that we think are effectively stress-tested through the process that we're going through.
Mr Banks, Stephen Long from the ABC. I thought there were very interesting and potentially very worthwhile recommendations in the report, but when I read it, I was puzzled as to how you derived your core assumption, which was that the market for executive salaries functions much like any other market. I saw you found a statistical correlation between size of firm and executive salary levels, but then it seemed to me that there was an assertion or a logical leap that was because companies were in a position with that size to purchase the best talent and had a strong interest in doing so, and therefore the salaries were a reward for skill. There's a whole body of international literature that shows a very weak correlation between executive salaries and corporate performance, and indeed there's a whole body of literature that argues that labour markets don't function like other markets, let alone markets for executive salaries. Where is the evidence for that core assumption and assertion in your report?
Now, I'd hate to say that you were putting words into my mouth, Stephen, but we didn't say that. So we said that the market for executives wasn't too dissimilar from labour markets generally. We didn't say that both of them were like the market for cabbages, if that's where you were going. And, I mean, they have obviously two sides to the market, and they have particular characteristics that reflect the nature of those markets. Now, one of the points we made, and we've seen the literature that you've referred to and understand that literature, but one of the points that we made was that in a large firm, in a firm that's with a market cap of billions of dollars, the value of the CEO becomes proportionally more important than the value of a CEO in a small firm. And in fact, I don't want to lapse into economist jargon, but the value of the marginal product of that person is proportionately higher. So the sheer scale of the firm, the sheer capacity of the CEO at the margin to make decisions that could add millions of dollars of value or take away millions of dollars of value from shareholders in itself is a very important reason why boards will be seeking to have the best person. Now, another argument is, well, anybody can do that job. Now, that's probably true within limits, but not everybody could do the job equally well. And it follows from what I said that even if you had a pool of 10 candidates, all of whom have similar experience, etc., there are some qualities that will stand out in terms of the board's perception of the impact on the performance of the firm. Judgment being one, even empathy another one, communication skills, things that people do vary on and that are subjective in nature. And getting the right package of those skills is a very critical issue for a company, and much more important for a big company because of the downsides as well as the upsides from getting it wrong. And we've all seen what happens when CEOs, the wrong CEO is appointed to a company. So I'm not saying that the market's perfect. That market's not perfect like other markets. And if mistakes are made, you do see the consequences for that. But that, to me, only illustrates the point that those decisions are very important ones to companies, very important ones for boards. And erring on the side of paying a CEO a bit more, maybe more than that person needs to get out of bed in the morning, but to ensure that they get the right person to deliver the right job for the shareholders of that particular company is a very important thing.
Couldn't it make just as much sense that there's a bigger pool of money to draw upon in terms of the size issue with salary?
Well, are you telling me that a large company maybe is more insensitive, has more capacity to pay an extra $1 million and not notice it than a smaller one? But that's just the flip side of the point I'm making. You know, that a large company has a lot at stake as well. But anyway, I think it's all in our report. And if you read Chapter 4, Stephen, I'm sure you'll be convinced.
There's a question.
I read it.
Okay.
Harris Van Beek from the Nous Group. I'm interested, you made the comment that markets may not be suitable for some areas of public service or service delivery. And I'm interested, my comments are partly in the context of what I saw as an over-enthusiastic embracing of markets for the delivery of some services and they've not always, I think, delivered as well as they were originally intended. So my question to you is, and this, for example, in the services in remote areas of Australia for Indigenous people, I think you've done a report on that. So my question to you is, how does a government make a decision of whether or not markets are appropriate for the delivery of services? And secondly, what are the implications for government? Because my understanding is that, for example, when the Rudd government was elected, they found that many public servants had become, or public services had become much more equipped at managing contracts than being good at developing public policy. And so the fundamental role of government when you outsource services becomes quite stretched. And I'm wondering if you could speak about how you make the decisions and what the impact is on the public service.
Well, there's a lot there, and more than I could respond to here. I mean, those decisions about the market versus government doing itself, I think, are quite subtle ones, and they hinge on the nature of the incentives, how well you can define success, and therefore how well you can monitor outcomes. And all of those things are very important. I think we've gone through a process of experimenting with contracting out in all sorts of areas in relation to certain services for the unemployed, for example, and in relation to even contracting out policy advice or policy analysis. And I think we are on a learning curve about those things. One thing that we have learnt is that for government to be a good contractor, for government to make the best use of the market or market participants, they also need to know that everything that those participants know and be able to monitor their performance and devise the contracts in a way that are just as smart as the way in which those contracts will be put into action. So some of the problems we've had with private-public partnerships, for example, I think have reflected government not being a very smart contractor or supervisor of contracts or designer of contracts, rather than necessarily being an inherent flaw in that model. Equally, I think when government is contracting out policy analysis, whether it be modelling or other survey-based work or other analysis, there needs to be people within the administration who are designing those contracts and supervising the work, who actually understand a good product from a bad one. So there's a great danger in contracting out too much, that you lose the capability, not to do it yourself necessarily, but the capability to screen and understand the quality of the work that's coming back from contractors in the market. So that's a very general response, but I think those things are particularly important, that we get the right balance in that area too.